Hello, everybody. This is the Midweek Catch-up webinar on business, and I can't see my own camera because I've got this huge screen up, and this is the first one for me. Alec asked me to do it, discussing general news, and we're going to really chew over some issues. Sometimes it will be political, sometimes it will be economics, or the problems at Sasol, the problems at Eskom, or whatever. And I'm hoping the business community would participate. I've already received a couple of questions about our guest today. We're still battling to get Moeletsi Mbeki on. Somehow Safari on MacBook didn't want to allow him in. But I've got Jakkie Cilliers, and I've known Dr. Jakkie Cilliers from the Institute of Security Studies for quite a number of years. I'm going to pop up his bio. And Jakkie, can you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thanks, Linda. My name is Jakkie Cilliers. I'm the founder of the Institute for Security Studies, but I stepped down several years ago. I now head a unit that does long-term forecasting. It's called African Futures and Innovation. So I spend my days looking to where Africa is going and where South Africa is going. So I've written a book on the future of South Africa. That was called Fate of the Nation, and I've recently published a book on the long-term future of Africa called Africa First.
Okay,
Thanks, Linda. I stay in your old house.
Yeah, well, it's so funny because we were looking this morning. I said that window looks familiar because when we sold our house in Pretoria, Jakkie bought it. So when I saw that window, I immediately knew that background is very familiar to me. So while our managing editor, Stuart Lohman, is trying to get Moeletsi Mbeki online, I'm just going to introduce the subject. As we know, South Africa is again at a crossroads. We are in what people have called a perfect storm. We have, well, junk status now. We've got a technical recession. The state-owned enterprises is still sucking the state coffers out of money. And then out of the blue, or out of the east, came this virus, the coronavirus. And initially, everybody applauded the government's response on what they were doing. Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, was really applauded for what he was doing, not only in our country, but also overseas. But that's gone a bit sour with people think that some of the lockdown measures are very draconian. And there seems to be a debate within the ANC at the moment. They are the ones that support Ramaphosa that seems to support the idea of opening up the economy. Ramaphosa himself said the crisis needs to become an opportunity. And then there seems to be a faction that's always been there, but with quite a strong voice now, that want to increase government control. They don't like that the government is going to the International Monetary Fund, and they talk about more control over the South African Reserve Bank and the economy. So while Moeletsi is not here yet, Jakkie, can we just look a little bit back at what was going on during the coronavirus pandemic and decisions the government was taking? Does that politically point to where we're going into the future?
Linda, I believe that President Ramaphosa is fairly firmly in the saddle, and that that his leadership within the ANC is not really contested, but he is a consensus leader, and what he is trying to do is to take everybody along in the journey of the future of South Africa. And initially he did very well, as we all know, in terms of building an inclusive, sort of a social compact on how South Africa is to respond to the COVID crisis. But lately there have been a number of challenges, because it seems that particular members within his cabinet, particularly Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, have put certain proposals on the table that cabinet has subsequently endorsed. But this has created the impression of a deeply divided cabinet and a leader that is not providing the required direction on the future of South Africa. And that certainly has undermined his authority, and also the call that he's made, that he is going to use this opportunity of COVID to take South Africa into a new social compact that will deliver economic growth. Many of us would say that requires more economic freedom, stepping away from efforts at state control. But when we look at
the business community certainly want that. The business community wants sort of, him to step up and speed up the reforms.
Yes, but what we've seen, particularly with the discussion document that came from Enoch Konungwana from the ANC Economic Committee, seems to continue to emphasize areas about state intervention and so on that are deeply worrying, I think, to many investors and to the business community.
Well, do you think there's been a policy shift? I mean, in other words, this is what Ramaphosa was trying to do, Mboweni was trying to do, but there seems to be some people in the ANC that's actually even supporting the ideas of EFF leader Julius Malema of a white suicide, he's calling it, the end of white capitalism.
Yes, there's this strange notion that you can shoot the zebra in the white spot, in the white stripes, and that the black stripes won't die. It's just completely crazy stuff. And I think the interventions and the engagement by Malema, these are not serious. These are the demented interventions of somebody who's interested in political power and not really interested in growing the country. What South Africa needs is rapid economic growth. It is more important than anything else. But what has been happening, the ANC is caught between a school of thought that continues to believe in the economic policies of yesteryear and sort of state control and focuses on the importance of redistribution, where I think that the consensus is that we really need to grow the economy and use the proceedings from that economic growth for building a more inclusive society.
Well, Jakkie,
hello, hello,
I've
it's
got Moeletsi Mbeki. Oh, Moeletsi Mbeki.
Yes, I'm sorry, Safari won't open the picture, but anyway, I can hear everything on the phone.
I'm so glad to hear that, Moeletsi. So we don't have your picture. You're on the phone for us. I'm so glad.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna throw up your lovely picture, and you know what? You've got us in the background there. I love
Okay.
So
I don't know what's wrong with Safari. Anyway, it's fine. Go ahead.
Well, I've got a picture up of you, and I'm so sorry about that. I'm just glad we have you here. I've did a little bio of you here. You're the Deputy Chairman of the South African Institute for International Affairs. You're a well-known political analyst, and you've got a book, Architects of Poverty, Why African Capitalism Needs Changing. And I need to ask you about African capitalism. Apart from that, everybody knows that your brother is Thabo Mbeki, the former president, and your father was known as Governor Mbeki, who spent time with Nelson Mandela at Robben Island. We've started off in the beginning, I don't know if you heard that, just setting the scene, and I'd like to ask you now, there were some controversial decisions of the cabinet, the banning of first smoking and alcohol, and later it was we can now have alcohol. Is that an indication of what's going on in the ANC at the moment, or is that just a sideshow?
Well, I think it's too difficult to generalize to the ANC as an organization. I think what it is indicating to me is that the president does not have complete control over his cabinet. So the idiosyncrasies of cabinet ministers, like Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma's preoccupation with smoking, are being indulged by the president and passed off as cabinet policies. So I think that is more the problem rather than the ANC as an institution, is that the president is weak and he doesn't control his cabinet ministers. He allows them to really promote their own little agendas, which are not necessarily political. I mean, to say people shouldn't smoke is not political. It's just one of the preoccupations of Minister Dlamini-Zuma. Yeah. So I think that's more the problem rather than the ANC as such.
So is there a danger of Jakkie said earlier, he didn't think that Ramaphosa is in danger, is he?
No, I don't think he's in danger, because if he was going to allow all and sundry to say and do whatever they want to do, so why should they want to remove him? So there's this is just the guy they want to keep there, who will let them do as they wish. So I agree with Jakkie that he is not in danger in terms of his position, but of course, as a government, his government sounds confused and not really focused.
I think the other issue for me, which is always important, is to recognize that Ramaphosa is significantly more popular than the ANC. For the ANC to get rid of Ramaphosa, which I don't think will happen, will split the party and will mean that it will probably lose its majority at the next election. So the idea that somehow there is a faction within the ANC that is going to depose Ramaphosa would be the ultimate destruction of the party itself. So I support Moeletsi on this.
So what about COSATU? Clearly that the COSATU and the South African Communist Party aren't keen on getting money from the International Monetary Fund. So what is going on there at the moment?
Okay, where are you? Is that?
Oh yeah. Well, any of you jump in. Moeletsi, okay, you go first.
Okay. Well, I did hear Jakkie pointing out that there are people in the ANC who live in the past, and this is very true. So there are people who think the IMF is like the devil, and therefore, if you see this devil, you're gonna die, or something horrible is gonna happen to you. Well, the IMF was never that. There was huge mismanagement of African economies, especially in the 70s and in the 80s. And because they incurred a lot of debt and a huge balance of payment problems, they then had to go to the IMF. Now, the IMF is a bank. So as a bank, if they lend you money, they want to know that you will be able to pay your money back. So the so-called structural adjustment programs came into effect. But the real reason for the structural adjustment programs was the mismanagement of the economies by African governments during that time. And the only way in which they could be loaned, they could get loans from the International Monetary Fund was on conditions that any bank would have given them. Now there's some element in the ANC, and unfortunately they don't know the story. They don't know. I mean, I was in exile in the African continent for many years, but I was working as an ordinary resident in Tanzania, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia. So I knew the debates about structural adjustments, and I was affected by it. But the ANC, most of the ANC who were there were diplomats, effectively, of the ANC, and they never got involved. They just picked up bits and pieces. They never understood what was going on in the economies of African countries. So they built up prejudices about the World Bank, about the IMF, about structural adjustment, but they don't know the real story behind it. So this is the problem that we have. Now, COSATU, which was not even there, knows even less about the International Monetary Fund. So these are some of the problems.
Yeah. So this loan doesn't have the conditionalities that it did have in the past, does it? This loan that the IMF offered?
No, every bank has a conditionality. If I go and borrow money from my bank for my mortgage, there is a conditionality, which is that I pay back every month a certain amount of money and at a certain level of interest. So every bank has a condition. So it's ridiculous for COSATU and others to think you can go and borrow money from a bank and there are no conditions attached.
Jakkie, you travel on the African continent a lot. There is a lot of resistance to it. But can I pose this question to you? Because questions are coming in from our community now. There's Stan Malema. He says, is a cabinet decision sponsored by any particular minister necessarily make the decision bad? In other words, is such a decision not a collective decision? That's what he's asking. That's Stan Malema.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that we have not seen in the Ramaphosa cabinet is a degree of unity and discipline and control. We have ministers speaking left, right, contradicting one another. And it seems like the president is like trying to herd cats. And it undermines confidence. The focus is on unity, and that inevitably means that it's sort of lowest common denominator politics. And I think this is very concerning. When you speak of for example, of the IMF loans that you've done a few minutes ago, the terms and conditions of IMF loans are significantly better than from any other bank, and particularly from the Chinese. So this idea that somehow we are losing our sovereignty is a myth. But as Moeletsi also indicated, it comes from a time during the 80s and the 90s when the IMF, in response to mismanagement in Africa, tried to downsize African governance and so on. But in any case, I really think that we have a problem in terms of the direction and common messaging within from cabinet.
Okay, I think we'll get a little bit later. I'm just going to say, how do we fix all this? I'm sure you two both have ideas about that. We just have one response here from Linda Horsfield, who says, so honored to have the two speakers, just that you know about that. And then there's the inevitable question when we talk about politics in South Africa. From Glenda from Benoni said, many South Africans have relatives in Zimbabwe. To what extent do you think South Africa is heading down the same path, given that we're hearing about land grabs and Black economic empowerment? Anybody want to answer that?
Well, I don't think there's going to be any land grabs in South Africa, other than the peri-urban squatter kind of issue. So you have people have to separate between the rural-urban migration issue, which is not just rural South Africa, it's also the rest of Southern Africa, which is migrating to the cities in South Africa. Now, these migrants are settling in informal settlements. So there is the land that gets expropriated by those people. It's not expropriated by the government. So that's point number one. Then you have the agricultural sector. Now, I'm talking about the commercial agricultural sector, not the communal agricultural sector. The commercial agricultural sector. Nobody in South Africa has said that, other than maybe the EFF, has said that there should be a seizure of agricultural land along the lines of what happened with ZANU-PF from 2000 onwards. So I don't think that is really something that is a major factor with South Africa. Of course, there is the uncertainty of government policies over many fronts, including over the agricultural front. The latest coming out of the last ANC Congress, which is expropriation of land without compensation. That's only one of the problems of the uncertainty of policies of the government. But there were lots of other uncertainties of policy even before that. So I don't see much. Sorry. So yes. I was saying I don't see a threat of land seizures along the lines of Zimbabwe, because remember, the land seizures in Zimbabwe were driven by ZANU-PF itself. They were not spontaneous, as many people think. So if they were to happen in South Africa, it would mean the ANC itself, which is the government, has to drive them. And the ANC knows perfectly well that South Africa is fed, the population, especially the urban population, gets its food from commercial agriculture. And if they started tinkering with commercial agriculture, they would have an uprising in the cities because there won't be any food. The difference between us and Zimbabwe could solve its problems. It could interfere with the food production system and then export the hungry population to South Africa. So that's why Mugabe felt quite happy to do what he did with the commercial agricultural sector. But South Africa has no one to exploit the population to. So if they allowed that to happen, there would be an insurrection in the urban areas in South Africa.
Well, we talk about interference in policy. What about the national health insurance idea? It seems that what's happening now, the cooperation or partnership that there is with the private sector, that Ramaphosa is quite keen to let this lead into this vision of a national health insurance. Jakkie, do you want to go in, and answer that one?
Yeah, I mean the problem in South Africa is well known, and we earlier this year did a long-term forecast once again on the future of South Africa, where we looked long-term. And when you look long-term at what drives productive growth in South Africa, then our poor human capital endowment, poor health and poor education are the largest structural constraints on South Africa's growth. And we were quite surprised by particularly the extent to which poor health outcomes is a constraint on development. So there's no doubt that South Africa needs some type of national health scheme. Our problem is not that. Our problem is the proven inability of government to be able to manage anything of that order. And that's the concern. We have an overserviced, very expensive private healthcare sector in South Africa that provides healthcare that is of the best standard globally, but it's overserviced and it's very expensive and it's not available. So how do we marry these two? And what government wants to do previously was to subsume the private sector into the public sector, and that would never work. And I think what all of us are saying is that, yes, we need to move towards a national health insurance scheme, but it has to draw upon a functioning, very expensive, overserviced private sector, and that rebuilds the public health sector. The public health sector in South Africa is not managed well, and this really is the heart of almost every problem that we are faced in South Africa, and that is poor management, incompetence, sometimes poor policies, very often too much policy and too much regulation. So I think everybody supports the idea. It's the implementation that really presents us with huge problems.
So if we can look now at, what's the solutions? So there's clearly a problem. The problem is much bigger now because of COVID-19. What are the solutions? Somebody sent a question to me earlier, Moeletsi, you talked about war. I think you referred earlier that there's a possibility, or there's this low-grade civil war between the business elite and the political elite. And could this be exacerbated in this environment after COVID-19?
Well, to add to the problems of growth to South Africa that Jakkie listed, is the lack of trust between the business elite and the political elite in South Africa. And this is one of the huge, huge problems we have, because it's a contributor to low investment in our economy. The business community has a massive taxation burden, and this taxation burden is not going to build the infrastructure that enables the business sector to become profitable. It goes to building the consumption sector in the public sector. So if the taxation system that we have, which is very big, by the way, by global standards, we are one of the most highly taxed countries in the world. But if that tax went into building a proper infrastructure that makes our businesses operate cheaply, competitive, and all the rest of it, then there would be no problem. But the problem is that the government, the state, taxes the economy to finance the consumption of the political elite, especially in the public sector. I mean, the Tito Mboweni last year revealed that over 29,000 public servants earn more than R1 million a year. So there's huge taxing of Now, this causes a lot of problems for what is called business confidence. So South Africa has very low business confidence because of the lack of rapport between the business elite and the political elite in this country.
Yeah, and Jakkie, you solutions forward. What are the solutions forward?
Well, I think the challenge is that the solutions are in actual fact fairly well known. We've talked a little bit about health. We know the problems that we have in education, that poor quality and a lack of investment in science, technology, engineering, and maths. In energy, we know that the problem is government continues to pursue to protect the coal industry largely because of mining, and whereas we know that the CSIR has recommended a least cost energy solution that will take South Africa much further. In manufacturing, we know we need to invest in research and development and so on. We all know these things. Government just doesn't do anything about it. And that's really this is essential problem that we face. There is generally lots of policy, there's very little implementation, and government keeps on talking about a capable state. South Africa, particularly where we are at the moment, no longer has the option of trying to pursue this developmental capable state. We need a stronger state, but the efforts to try and build SOEs and to maintain state control of large sections of the South African economy are just simply no longer tenable. They are no longer affordable. When you look at our long-term growth forecasts, and we've done, we've had a look at this, South Africa, if it carries on its current trajectory, is not going to be able to grow incomes and reduce inequality and reduce poverty more rapidly enough unless there are really structural constraints, changes to our economy. Much more investment and economic freedom, as Moeletsi said. Investment in the South African economy is largely driven by confidence, and the international and the South African business community have lost confidence. And so we can carry on. If you're looking at land and agriculture, and Moeletsi spoke about this a little bit previously, land hunger is in the urban areas. There won't be big scale agricultural land expropriation, but the solution to South Africa's land problem lies in unleashing the potential of poor South Africans that live in the former homelands under a parallel system of tribal leadership that is unconstitutional and so on and so forth. All of this, we keep on saying, requires a kind of a social compact. But given the hostility that Moeletsi refers to, the distrust between business, which is the only sector that can still drive economic growth, and government, and a ruling elite that that in certain instances harks back to the Soviet Union, Cuba, and these kind of examples of poor economic growth, that confidence we don't seem to be able to bridge and build the social compact that we all desire.
Well, this is something from an unexpected question. Somebody said medical cannabis is becoming more and more popular globally as a better health alternative, and it's highly lucrative. Is there a reason why South Africa is lacking behind regarding this? I know that Tito Mboweni at one stage said, yeah, let's go for it. We can tax that. Any thoughts on that? Wow.
We'll smoke pot and feel better. It is without a doubt, it's an area where there is considerable opportunity also in South Africa for particularly smallholder farms, but also for economic opportunity. But it certainly is not a solution to South Africa's structural economic challenges.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say. I think we South Africans have to stop clutching at straws. The reality is that for the past century and a half, South Africa has been able to survive on our enormously rich mineral resources. So we tend to think of panaceas when we are faced with problems, because we're still looking backward. We think, okay, we have a problem somewhere, we will find diamonds and that will solve the problem. And then another one comes up, we find gold, we solve that problem. Another one comes up, we find coal and so on, and platinum and whatever. So well, that happened in the past. It's not going to happen now. The use of metals and the demand of minerals is declining. I was reading this morning that for the last 2 weeks, Britain has not used coal to generate electricity.
Yeah.
Now we are pumping up coal production, but the world is moving away from coal production.
Yeah.
So our real problem, to me anyway, as a political analyst, our real problem in South Africa is that we don't have a powerful political opposition. But at the end of the day, you know, we, Jakkie, myself, the professors at universities can give the government as many solutions as they are, and they do. I mean, they do give the government the solution, but without political opposition that threatens the power of the incumbent government, it will carry on doing whatever it's doing, because what it is doing is giving it votes, and it gives it money through the tax system, and it will carry on doing that until the economy crashes, because it no longer can milk this particular cow. So the real problem in South Africa, or one of our biggest problems, is that we don't have a realistic opposition. Look what happened to the United States, to Donald Trump, once the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives. Then the opposition came up, and you are seeing this now during the crisis over the killing of George Floyd. The House of Representatives is drafting legislation to limit the powers of the police, despite what Trump and the Republicans are saying. So that is the challenge that we have in South Africa, is we don't have a strong enough opposition. So why should the government listen to anyone? And it won't listen to anyone who it thinks might put it at risk.
Jakkie, do you want to comment on that? Because I've got we're going a little bit over our time, but if people don't mind, we're going to hang in there a little bit. There's a question from Marcus Dekena. He says, South Africa's economy was trapped in a structural recession prior to COVID. Our economy will not lift off without first addressing our structures of recession. What are the key structural issues, the drivers of this recession? Can the panel please comment?
Well, I think that the main driver, which is actually what we've been discussing, is poor governance. It is bad. Our policies are well, there are many areas that they can be improved, and the direction perhaps is wrong. But we simply have a political class that is not interested and does not focus on growth and development. There is nothing more important in South Africa than economic growth. And what needs to be done to unlock economic growth is well known, it's well established. We've been discussing all of them this morning, for example, investor confidence and so on and so forth. The reality is just simply that government, as Moeletsi has been saying, is not sufficiently, does not feel sufficiently pressurized to implement any of that. So we are trapped in a slow growth future, and our forecasts really confirm that. The kind of structural change that we need, we often discuss it. We generally know what needs to be done. The reality is that government just simply, on the one side, can't implement it, but on the other side, just does not seem to really want to focus on unlocking South Africa's growth potential. And without much more rapid economic growth, South Africa will remain unhappy and bitter and divided. And that really, for me, is at the heart of this.
That almost sounds like you're signing off. Okay, let's see. A last comment from you, because I've probably got to wrap this up now.
And then
last comment.
You can go.
Yes, of course, Stuart.
Yes.
Oh, we can go on because there's questions about alcohol. I think we need to get to that. So, so what do you say? Structurally, do you think we've answered that question?
Well, let me add to the challenge of growth and to the structural changes. You know, the South African economy, the one strength of the South African economy is that we have a very powerful data collection system. So Stats SA is a very powerful institution, and then we have other private institutions like the advertising companies have their own data collection and so on and so forth. So we know almost everything that is wrong with South Africa. We know what it is, and the government knows what it is. But as they say, you cannot get the leopard to change its spots. The ANC government's instinct, let me put it that way, its instinct is not production. Its instinct is consumption. Yeah. Now, we can go through all the history that shapes this mindset, but the mindset of the ANC and of the ANC government, of ANC supporters, is that they must consume, because in the past they were deprived of consumption. So, but you don't get growth just from consumption. You get growth from investment. So this is the challenge that the ANC has, is that it can't change its spots. Its spots tell it to consume, and it consumes, and it transfers resources from the production side of the economy to the consumption side of the economy. Whether this is civil service salaries, whether this is the welfare state, whether you can name it. That is the ANC's DNA. That is why you need an opposition party with a different DNA, which is more focused to growth, to investment, and so on. And then they compete for the vote, because the ANC has no competition at the moment. So it will carry on doing what it is doing. So the knowledge part of it is not our problem. We know the problem. We know the government Eskom has been building power stations forever. We should have been commissioned 10 years ago. But that's not the DNA of the ANC government and its institutions like Eskom. Is not efficiency. It's not production. It's consumption. You have this huge civil service. You have the huge state-owned enterprise employees who are paid massive salary. I read somewhere that the average salary at Eskom is 700,000 rands. You know, I was in China a few years ago. I was looking to buy locomotives, and I asked the CEO of the Chinese government company. It was called South China Railways. They were employing 10,000 people. I asked him what his salary was. It was 300,000 rands a year. Yeah. If you compare him to the SOE salaries of the guys who are running these non-performing, they're getting millions. They're being paid millions. So that's why I'm saying is that many people keep asking the leopard to change its spots. It won't. The point is that you have to have an alternative.
Okay, if you guys don't mind hanging on, the questions are sort of flowing in now. Somebody has this question: what does your guest think of the narrative that Cyril and the ANC is busy with the frog in the pot of hot water that they're slowing turning up the heat with? He says, are you familiar with that? Yeah, of course you are. Basically taking wealth from the whites and give it to a few political elites until there is no more. That's quite a provocative question. Does anybody want to answer that?
Well, let me try and make a few remarks on that. We've been bashing the ANC and bashing the South African government with, I think, quite correctly so. But if you look at the first 10, 12 years of the ANC government, in actual fact, it did very well. It delivered economic growth. It delivered water, sanitation, basic infrastructure to millions of South Africans. But then the wheels came off with Jacob Zuma, with the global financial downturn in 2008. And we've not, and it, that was a lost decade. It is not impossible for South Africa to regain its foothold. The point that I just want to make is that the ANC, and Moeletsi has spoken about this, responds to a different clientele, a different electorate orientation. We ask government and President Ramaphosa to lead us into a future where there is growth and employment opportunities. But because of a lack of a threat to their governing status, they are not doing that. But it's not because they are somehow only interested in looting the state. I think there is a deep philosophical orientation, black nationalist, in certain instances, sort of orientation about how society should work that underpins a very large faction within the governing party. But I'm afraid Moeletsi is probably right, and that is that what is happening, there is no credible national opposition party that opposes the ANC. And what is happening, people are losing interest in politics. They're stepping away from participating in elections. And that leaves the governing party to do what it wants to. Now, what is interesting is that, of course, that South Africa's constitution means that as we head forward, and by 2024, we are going to see a situation where the ANC will most probably lose Gauteng, and particularly in Gauteng, may lose its majority. We're heading for a future of coalition politics. And we are still learning how to govern through coalitions. On the one side, coalitions may mean that you have an impasse in government, where you don't have a strong majority. But on the other hand, maybe that at a regional, at a provincial level, can bring more accountability to bear. And that is the future that I think at the moment is still a little bit unsure exactly how that's going to unfold.
Well, Moeletsi also talks about the need for a strong opposition. There's two questions from our audience. Beverly Steenkamp says, well, how do you build a strong opposition? And linked into that is whether the ANC could be punished for how it handled the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns.
Yes, but who's going to punish the ANC for how it's handling the COVID-19? Because,
so you know, that brings... opposition?
Yes, it brings you back to that South Africa. I mean, okay, let me just say, you know, countries like us, like India and so on, like, you know, Ghana and others, which were colonies, they have their first 20, 30 years where the Liberation Party is dominant, right? So you had this with the National Party. We forget that, okay, the blacks didn't have a vote, but given the vote that those who had the vote, the National Party was dominant for decades. And it nearly brought South Africa to the verge of a civil war with its dominance. So this is the problem of single party dominance. Is very costly to the society because they carry on with policies. I mean, the National Party first should never have had apartheid policy, but given that it had an apartheid policy, it should have known by 1963, 64, after Sharpeville, that this policy has no future. But they persisted with it until 1990. So this is when the country now was on the verge of a civil war. So this is the challenge, that we now have another era of single party dominance, and this single party dominance is leading us to a real serious economic crisis and a financial crisis for the country. And that is the million-dollar question that South Africa is faced with, that we all as South African citizens have to go through. And I'm not, so it's not just the ANC. China under Mao Zedong was so dominant, the Communist Party, and it nearly destroyed China with the cultural revolutions, with all sorts of pet projects of Mao Zedong, huge famines, millions of people dying, taking China into wars against the United States and Korea, and so on and so forth. So the problem of single-party dominance is a very serious issue. That is a challenge that we don't want this to continue to be perpetuated in South Africa because the risks are just too high.
So what's going to happen? There's somebody that asked, Ralph Droitovsky said, can you comment on the future of the labor unions? Would there eventually, do you think, either of you be a split between the ANC and its alliance partners?
Well if I could say, so, okay, go on.
No, carry on. You're much more an expert in this than I am.
Yes, I worked for the unions. I worked for COSATU in the early 90s. And the trade union leadership, one has to be realistic. The trade union leadership was in partnership with the ANC and is to some extent still is. And this has led to the near destruction of the trade union movement in this country. The COSATU, different sides of COSATU, aligned themselves with Jacob Zuma in his fight against Thabo Mbeki, and so on and so forth. So what has happened is that COSATU then started to fragment. So Vavi was kicked out. The largest union was kicked out. The mine workers union, which was if not the largest, the second largest, splintered and led to the formation of AMCU. So the unions, many people think the unions have muscle in this country, and the ANC pretends that the unions have muscle. They have no muscle. We saw in April, the ANC refused to implement, the ANC government refused to implement a pre-agreed wage increase that was agreed in 2018. That was a 3-year agreement. The government just decided to ignore and not implement. And the unions are stuck. They don't know what to do because they haven't got the muscle to do anything. They are hoping the courts will solve the problem for them. So the unions are not the main problem in South Africa. The ANC hides behind the unions when it's convenient, but they have no power. They are very fragmented. And in a direct interest of their own, which is their own salary increase, the unions have failed to fight for themselves. So let alone be an obstacle to government policy. The unions are not an obstacle to government policy. Government this is just propaganda. When it suits the politicians, they say, no, we can't do it because our communist ally. I mean, the Communist Party is absolutely nothing. It's a coterie of some gentlemen who get ministerial jobs in the government. They have no constituency. That's why they can't stand for an election. They tried to stand for one local election in I think it was in the Free State somewhere, and they couldn't get elected. They only got PR votes. They couldn't get direct election. So the Communist Party and the COSATU are not an obstacle to what the government is doing. It's pure propaganda when the government says we can't do this because of the Communist Party and the unions. That's not true. It's the choice that the ANC government has made.
Okay, Jakkie, you say that's more Moeletzi's field of expertise. Can we quickly just look at what the impact of COVID-19? You travel in Africa a lot. You deal with especially Kenya, I think it is a lot. What would the impact of COVID-19 and what's happening in our neighbors be on South Africa?
I assume that's to me.
Yes. Sorry, Jakkie, that's to you.
Well, make no mistake that COVID-19 is going to deliver Africa a huge blow. We are actually at the final stages of finalizing a forecast on the impact of COVID on Africa, and I can summarize that to you very briefly. I was just drawing. I'll just give you an indication. In this year alone, COVID is going to mean that about 14 million additional Africans are classified as being extremely poor. The average size of the African economy is going to decline by about $150 billion this year. And I can carry on. COVID is taking Africa backwards by about 5-6 years. It's going to take us a long time to recover. Not only because of what's happening in Africa, but because of the impact of the global contraction upon Africa, a continent that is increasingly dependent upon commodity exports and so on. So the impact is significant. We are all hoping that, like in South Africa, what would happen is that the challenges with COVID will will speed up, for example, the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, speed up digitization and leapfrogging on the continent, because it in actual fact sets Africa significantly further behind the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So that's the positive, and I think that's also, we were speaking about South Africa. We are also hoping that the president will in actual fact use this opportunity of the challenges in South Africa to implement the policies, the recommendations that are so obvious that need to be done. So COVID is much larger than the 2008 global economic recession in terms of its impact on Africa.
Sure. Moeletsi, would you like to say anything about the impact on Africa?
Well, I agree. I'm not really following the research on COVID-19 other than being locked down at home like everybody else. But really, I can understand that on the African continent, this is going to be devastating in the way that it is going to be devastating on South Africa itself. We have large parts of our population, especially the urban population, who are living in very crowded conditions. And to me, as a layperson, those seem to be like perfect incubation environments for this kind, for viruses of any nature, which is partly why in South Africa we can't get rid of tuberculosis. Is because of these kinds of environments. So we with the massive urban crowding that you get in all African cities, whether in South Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria, all over Africa, then it seems to me that COVID-19 is here to stay until the vaccine is found. And it will have the consequences that Jakkie says it's going to have. I fully accept what he says.
Moeletsi, somebody linked to what you said about the African continent. Vitsa Post has a question for you. What is your idea of African capitalism? He wants to know, what is that?
Oh yeah. Well, this book was published in 2009, Architects of Poverty. What I was addressing was precisely the issues that we've been talking about, which is that the African capitalism that we inherited from the colonialists, from the colonial era, were primary commodity producing form of capitalism, predominantly driven by peasants, by peasant agriculture, with pockets or enclaves of plantation agriculture, and then mining. And then the services that went with mining, like railways and harbors and so on. So that is the predominant form of capitalism in Africa. So what I was saying was that, and I still stand by that, is that African countries have to develop, like the rest of the world, an industrial economy and not be dependent on primary commodities for their exports. And this is still very much the case, and you can see in our own case in South Africa. I mean, we have been dependent on mineral exports virtually since the diamonds were discovered in the 1860s. We are still dependent on mineral exports. I did a calculation the other day. Our mineral and agricultural export make up about 65% of our exports. If you look at Malaysia, agricultural exports don't even appear. Their exports are predominantly manufactured product exports. And they have 3% or 4% unemployment. Now, Malaysia, were a colony like South Africa, they are very rich agriculturally. They have lots of minerals like we do, but they restructure their economy to become what it is today, which is a huge diversified manufacturing and services economy. So that's what I was saying, was that we are perpetuating the commodities export economy in Africa. And that's what has to change. Now, to change that requires a number of things to happen, one of which, for example, and I'm talking about the rest of Africa, one of which is huge land reform and the transfer of land from the state. Because in all the British colonies, let's take the former British colonies, the land belongs to the state. Now, we have to transfer the land to the peasants and create a commercial market in land itself. Then you will see the productivity of land growing up, and then the surpluses to finance entrepreneurship and to finance manufacturing, which is, a traditional road. That's how England became an industrial power. That's how Japan, that's how China is doing now, and so on. So those are the changes that we need to make in Africa.
Okay, we're going to need to wrap up. And Jakkie, you're also writing about igniting a growth revolution in Africa. So it's a similar theme, about different things that Africa should do to grow its economies.
Yes, I've just written a book that came out about 2 months ago, called Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution, which is really models and forecasts the transitions that have to happen in Africa if the continent is to undergo the change in the productive structures of its economy that Moeletsi has referred to. So he's spoken quite correctly about the importance of industrialization. Africa, what I refer to as made in Africa. We need to go up that curve. But there are many things that have to happen. And in Africa First, I model, in actual fact, the 11 transitions that have to happen. Africa has to go through its demographic transition. It has to invest in water and sanitation, in education. We need to implement the African Continental Free Trade Area, leapfrog, and so on and so forth. So the book is available on Amazon and in bookstores in South Africa. So that's really modeling the impact of all these transitions and what could happen by 2040 if all these good things come together and we start closing the gap. Because there's nothing magic about the transitions that South Africa or Africa have to happen. Moeletsi has spoken them, or every country in the world has more or less followed the same recipe. We just need to implement them. And that requires leadership and management.
Okay, I need to wrap up. Can we have a quick last comment from both of you?
Well, my quick comment is that we, the South African voters and the taxpayers, have to now seriously start thinking what needs to be done to have a more competitive political environment in this country. That is my summing up comment. If we don't have a competitive political environment, South Africa is going to sink lower and lower and lower. And what will happen is that eventually we will crash. And then when you crash, you hit the bottom. You never know how long you will be at the bottom and what will happen when you get there.
True. Jakkie?
Yeah, I think, I mean, South Africa faces many challenges, and but I travel a lot, and I tell you that I visited Algeria, Tunisia, Ethiopia, Angola, Zimbabwe, and so on, and things in South Africa are not looking good at the moment. But believe me, every country in the world at the moment thinks that they are in a particularly bad spot. So we still live in a wonderful country with lots of potential. We need to get our leadership and our policy direction sorted. No doubt about that. We are falling further and further behind our global peers. But I'm still hopeful that that would be possible. We're 25 years into the transition. That's about what other African countries took to get over their colonial challenges and start stabilizing. And I believe that that's also possible in South Africa.
Well, thank you, both of you. I really appreciate. Thanks, Dr. Jakkie Cilliers. Thanks, Moeletsi Mbeki, for coming on. And sorry about the fact that we couldn't get your camera working, Moeletsi. And if anybody wants to email me some suggestions at linda@biznews.com about stuff we can for the future discussions. We're not always going to do politics, anything that's in the news and makes you think. Thank you so much, and thank you. Bye, everybody. Thanks for the audience.
Thank you.